Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the English Talk community. I'm Julia, and I'm so excited you're here with me today. I've been getting so many messages from listeners saying they feel stuck translating everything in their heads, and I totally get it. I've been there too. When I first started learning my second language, I remember feeling completely exhausted after every conversation because my brain was working double time, constantly switching back and forth between languages. It's like having two computers running at the same time. It drains your energy and slows everything down. Today, we're going to talk about something that will change your English forever: how to train your brain to think directly in English without that exhausting mental translation. I want you to imagine for a moment what it would feel like to have a conversation in English, where the words just flow naturally, where you don't have to pause and search for translations in your head, where you can actually focus on what the other person is saying instead of struggling with your own response. That feeling of freedom and confidence, that's exactly what we're going to work toward today. Before we dive in, if this sounds like something you need in your life, go ahead and hit that like button right now. I know it might seem like a small action, but when you hit that like button, you're telling me that you're ready to make this change, that you're committed to breaking free from the translation trap that's been holding you back. And honestly, that commitment to yourself is the first step toward thinking naturally in English. If you're new here, welcome to our community of English learners from around the world. I want you to know that you're in the right place. This isn't just another English learning channel where we talk about boring rules and complicated theories. This is a community where we understand the real struggles you face every day when you're trying to communicate in English. We get it because we've been there. Make sure to subscribe because we release new episodes every week specifically designed to help you speak English naturally and confidently, without all the stress and overthinking that usually comes with language learning. I want to share something personal with you. A few years ago, I met a woman named Isabella from Rome at a coffee shop. She had been studying English for 8 years, and she knew all the rules. She could write perfectly, she could understand movies and books. But when it came to speaking, she was completely blocked. She told me that every time someone asked her a simple question like, "How was your day?" her mind would go blank. Not because she didn't know the words, but because she was so busy translating that she couldn't think straight. She said it was like having a traffic jam in her brain every time she wanted to speak. That conversation stayed with me because Isabella's story is so common. I hear it from listeners all over the world, from Marcus in Berlin, who freezes up in business meetings, from Sophie in Madrid, who avoids phone calls in English, from James in Lisbon, who understands everything but can't respond quickly enough in conversations. The frustrating thing is that these are all intelligent, capable people who have put in years of study, but they're stuck in this translation cycle that makes them feel like beginners every time they open their mouths. Here's what I want you to understand right from the start: this is not your fault. Nobody taught you how to think in English. In school, they taught you vocabulary lists, they taught you to translate sentences, they taught you to think in your language first, and then convert everything to English. That approach might work for written tests, but it's absolutely terrible for real communication. Real communication happens fast, it's spontaneous, it's emotional, and there's no time for mental gymnastics. But here's the amazing news: your brain is incredibly adaptable. Right now, as you're listening to me, your brain is processing English directly. You're not translating every word I say. You're understanding the meaning, you're following the story, you're connecting with the emotions I'm sharing. This proves that your brain already has the ability to work in English mode. We just need to expand that ability from listening and understanding to thinking and speaking. Think about this for a moment. When you dream, do you translate your dreams? When you have an emotional reaction to something, like getting excited or frustrated, does your brain translate that feeling? Of course not. Emotions and reactions happen directly, immediately. That's exactly how we're going to train your brain to work with English. We're going to bypass the translation step completely and create direct connections between your thoughts, feelings, and English words. The transformation I'm talking about isn't just about speaking faster or sounding more natural, though those things will definitely happen. It's about feeling comfortable and confident in English, about being able to express your real personality instead of the simplified, careful version of yourself that comes out when you're constantly translating. It's about finally feeling like yourself when you speak English, instead of feeling like you're wearing a mask or playing a character. So get comfortable, grab a cup of coffee or tea, and let's begin this journey together. By the end of today's episode, you're going to have practical tools and techniques that you can start using immediately to train your brain to think in English. You're going to understand exactly why mental translation is holding you back and how to break free from it once and for all. Before we dive deeper into solving this translation problem that's been holding you back, I need you to do something that will completely change your English learning journey. If you're tired of that exhausting mental gymnastics every time you want to speak English, if you're ready to finally express your true personality without the filter of translation, then hit that subscribe button right now. This community is filled with people just like you who are breaking free from translation barriers and discovering what it feels like to think naturally in English. And don't forget to smash that like button, because it tells me you're serious about making this transformation happen in your life. Now here's what I really want from you. Leave a comment below and tell me about your biggest translation struggle. Maybe you freeze up in important meetings because your brain is working overtime to translate everything. Maybe you have amazing thoughts and ideas, but they get lost in translation when you try to express them in English. Maybe you understand everything perfectly, but feel like a different person when you speak, because translation makes you sound formal and robotic. Share your story in the comments, because when you put your struggle into words, you're taking the first step toward solving it, and your experience might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to know they're not alone in this journey. Let me ask you something. Do you find yourself translating every single word from your native language before you speak? You're not alone in this struggle. I remember Maria from Madrid telling me how exhausted she felt after every English conversation because her brain was working overtime, translating back and forth. She would come home after a day at her international company and literally need to take a nap because the mental effort of constantly switching between languages had completely drained her energy. Maria described it perfectly. She said it felt like she was carrying 2 heavy suitcases everywhere she went, and she could never put them down. This mental translation is actually slowing you down and making you sound less natural. Think about what happens in your brain when someone asks you a simple question like, "What did you do yesterday?" If you're translating, your brain goes through this complex process. First, you hear the English question, then you translate it into your native language to understand it fully. Then you think of your response in your native language, then you translate that response back into English, and finally you speak. By the time you've done all of this mental work, the conversation has moved on, or there's this awkward pause that makes you feel even more self-conscious. When you translate in your head, you lose the rhythm and flow of English. English has its own melody, its own pace, its own way of connecting ideas. But when you're translating, you're not thinking in that English rhythm. You're thinking in the patterns of your native language and trying to force English words into those patterns. It's like trying to play a jazz song with the rhythm of a classical piece. The notes might be correct, but something feels off. I want you to think about a time when you were really engaged in an English movie or a song. Maybe you were so caught up in the story or the music that you forgot you were even listening to English. In those moments, you weren't translating. You were understanding directly, feeling the emotions directly, connecting with the content immediately. That's your brain working in English mode, and it's proof that you already have this ability. Your brain is capable of so much more than you think. Right now, you might believe that translation is necessary, that it's the only way you can be sure you're understanding and responding correctly. But translation is actually a crutch that's preventing your brain from developing its natural ability to work directly in English. It's like learning to ride a bicycle but never taking off the training wheels. You might feel safer, but you'll never experience the freedom and speed that comes with riding without support. Here's something that might surprise you. When you translate, you're not actually being more accurate or more careful. You're being slower and less natural. Native English speakers don't think about every word choice. They don't plan every sentence in advance. They don't translate their thoughts into words. They think and speak in one smooth process. Their thoughts are already in English, so speaking is just expressing those thoughts directly. I had a conversation with Andrea from Milan who told me something really interesting. She said that when she was translating in her head, she would often choose safe, simple words because those were the ones she could translate quickly. But when she started thinking directly in English, she found herself using more varied and natural expressions because she wasn't limited by her translation skills. She was accessing her full English vocabulary instead of just the words she could quickly convert from Italian. The translation trap affects different people in different ways. Some people, like Roberto from Barcelona, told me that he would start a sentence in English, get stuck on one word that he couldn't translate quickly, and then his whole thought would fall apart. He would lose track of what he was trying to say because he was so focused on finding the perfect translation for one specific word. Other people, like Francesca from Rome, said that translation made her English sound very formal and stiff because she was always choosing the most direct translations rather than the natural English expressions that would sound more conversational. There's also this emotional component that people don't talk about enough. When you're constantly translating, you're not just thinking about language. You're also worried about making mistakes. You're self-conscious about your accent. You're concerned about whether your translations are correct. All of this mental noise makes it even harder to have a natural conversation. It's like trying to have a relaxed dinner with a friend while someone is constantly tapping you on the shoulder asking questions. You can't fully be present in the moment. What's really frustrating is that translation often leads to overcomplication. Let me give you an example. If someone says, "How are you?" and you translate that question into your language, think about your response in your language and then translate it back. You might end up saying something like, "I am feeling quite well today. Thank you for asking." That's not wrong, but it's not how people naturally respond. A direct English thinker would probably just say, "I'm good, thanks," or "pretty well, how about you?" The translation process often makes us sound like we're writing a formal letter when we're just having a casual chat. Today, I'm going to show you exactly how to break free from this translation trap. The techniques I'm going to share with you are based on how your brain naturally learns and processes language. We're going to work with your brain's natural abilities instead of against them. We're going to help you discover that thinking in English isn't some mysterious skill that only native speakers have. It's something your brain is already capable of doing. Here's something amazing. Your brain already knows how to learn languages naturally. Think about how children learn. They don't translate, they just absorb and connect. When little Sophie from London learns the word apple, she doesn't think apple means this in my language. She just connects the word directly to the red, round fruit. She sees the apple, hears the word apple, and her brain creates a direct link between the object and the sound. There's no middleman, no translation process, no complicated mental gymnastics. It's pure, direct connection. Your adult brain can do this too. I know you might be thinking, "But Julia, I'm not a child anymore. My brain doesn't work that way." But that's not true. Your brain is incredibly plastic throughout your entire life. It's constantly creating new connections, learning new patterns, adapting to new information. The only difference is that as adults, we've been taught to complicate the process. We've been told that we need to understand the rules first, that we need to translate everything, that we need to think our way through language instead of feeling our way through it. The key is to create direct connections between English words and meanings, emotions, and experiences. Let me explain what I mean by this. When you hear the word warm, instead of thinking of the equivalent word in your native language, I want you to think of the feeling of sunshine on your skin, or a cozy blanket, or a hot cup of coffee in your hands. When you hear excited, don't translate it. Think of how your heart beats faster when something wonderful is about to happen. Think of that fluttery feeling in your stomach before a vacation or a first date. This is called building neural pathways, and once you understand this, everything becomes easier. Your brain is like a busy city with millions of roads connecting different neighborhoods. When you translate, you're taking the long route. You're going from the English neighborhood to your native language neighborhood, and then back to the English neighborhood to respond. But when you build direct pathways, you're creating shortcuts, express routes that go directly from English input to English output. I want to share something fascinating that happened with my friend Carlos from Lisbon. He was struggling with English for years using traditional methods, always translating, always overthinking. Then one day, he was watching an English comedy show, and something hilarious happened on screen. Without thinking, he laughed out loud and said, "That's so funny," in English. It wasn't planned, it wasn't translated. It was a direct emotional response. That moment was a breakthrough for him because he realized his brain could operate in English when he wasn't trying to control everything. Children are masters at this direct connection method. Watch a child learning any language. They point at things. They repeat sounds. They make connections through play and emotion. When little Emma from Berlin learns the word cold, she experiences it when she touches ice or goes outside in winter. Her brain doesn't think cold equals this word in German. Her brain thinks cold equals this physical sensation, this feeling, this experience. That's why children pick up languages so quickly and speak so naturally. They're not burdened by the need to translate everything. But here's what's really exciting. You can recreate this natural learning process. Your brain still has all the mechanisms that children use to learn languages. The neural plasticity, the ability to form new connections, the capacity to link sounds with meanings and emotions, it's all still there. We just need to activate it and use it in the right way. Let me give you a practical example of how this works. Think about the English word frustrated. Now, instead of translating this word into your language, I want you to remember a time when you felt frustrated. Maybe you were stuck in traffic, or your computer wasn't working, or you couldn't find something you needed. Feel that emotion for a moment, the tension in your shoulders, the impatience, the desire to fix something that isn't working. Now connect that feeling directly to the English word frustrated. You've just created a neural pathway that bypasses translation completely. This process happens naturally in many situations, and you probably don't even realize it. When you listen to English music and feel the emotions of the song, when you watch an English movie and get scared or excited without translating every word, when you read an English book and get lost in the story, in all these moments, your brain is working directly in English. You're not translating the emotion of the music, you're not translating the suspense of the movie, you're not translating the plot of the book. You're experiencing it all directly. The beautiful thing about natural language learning is that it's effortless and enjoyable. Children don't struggle to learn their first language because they're not fighting against their brain's natural processes. They're working with them. When you try to force translation and conscious control over every word, you're working against your brain's natural language learning mechanisms. But when you allow direct connections to form, when you trust your brain's ability to absorb and connect, learning becomes much more fluid and natural. I remember talking to Anna from Vienna, who told me about her aha moment. She was cooking dinner and following an English recipe video. At first, she was translating every instruction in her head. Chop the onions means, add the garlic means. But as she got more involved in the cooking, she stopped translating and started just following along directly. She understood stirred gently, not because she translated it, but because she could see what the chef was doing and connect the words directly to the action. By the end of the video, she was thinking in English about cooking, and it felt completely natural. This is the power of working with your brain's natural learning processes instead of against them. When you create direct connections between English and your experiences, emotions, and sensations, you're not just learning vocabulary. You're training your brain to operate in English mode. And once your brain gets comfortable operating in English mode for specific situations or topics, it becomes easier to expand that comfort zone to include more and more of your daily life and thoughts. Let me tell you about Thomas from Paris. He was so frustrated because every time he wanted to say something in English, he would first think in French, then translate. It was exhausting and slow. Thomas worked at an international marketing company, and he had to attend English meetings every day. He told me that by the end of each meeting, he felt like he had run a marathon because his brain was working so hard to keep up with the constant translation. He would sit in those meetings, understanding everything perfectly, but when it came time for him to contribute, there would be this painful pause while his mind went through the translation process. The worst part for Thomas wasn't even the slowness. It was the feeling that he couldn't express his real personality in English. In French, he was witty, spontaneous, engaging. In English, he felt like a robot, only able to produce careful, calculated responses that had been filtered through translation. He said it was like wearing a mask that made him feel distant from his colleagues and frustrated with himself. One day, he decided to try something different. Instead of translating the word hungry, he started connecting it directly to the feeling in his stomach. This happened during lunch break, when he was talking to his British colleague Sarah about lunch plans. Usually, when Thomas felt hunger, his brain would automatically think the French word first, then translate it to English. But that day, when he felt that empty, growling sensation in his stomach, he consciously made himself think hungry directly, not the French word first. At first, it felt strange and forced. He had been translating for so many years that thinking directly in English felt almost wrong, like he was skipping a step or cheating somehow. But Thomas was determined to break this pattern that was holding him back. So he continued with this experiment. When he felt thirsty, instead of thinking the French word and translating, he would connect the dry feeling in his mouth directly to the English word thirsty. When he felt tired, he would connect that heavy feeling in his eyes and body directly to tired. The breakthrough came about a week into this practice. Thomas was in a meeting, and someone asked if anyone wanted coffee. Without thinking, without any translation process, he immediately responded, "Yes, I'm really tired today." It wasn't until after he said it that he realized what had happened. He had responded directly from his feeling to English words, completely bypassing French. In that moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced since he started learning English. He felt like himself. Within just 2 weeks of practicing this direct connection method, Thomas noticed he was responding faster in conversations. The change wasn't dramatic at first, but it was noticeable. Instead of those long pauses while he translated, he was able to respond to basic questions about how he felt, what he wanted, what he needed, almost immediately. When someone asked, "How are you?" instead of thinking in French and then translating, "I am well" or "I am fine," he could directly access feelings like "I'm good" or "I'm a bit stressed" or "I'm excited about this project." He wasn't perfect, but he was thinking in English for basic needs and feelings. Thomas started expanding this technique beyond just physical sensations. When he felt frustrated with a project at work, instead of thinking the French word for frustration and then translating it, he would directly connect that tight, agitated feeling to, "I'm frustrated." When he felt proud of completing a difficult task, he would connect that warm, satisfied feeling directly to, "I'm proud of this work." What surprised Thomas the most was how this affected his confidence in other areas of English. Because he was no longer spending mental energy on translating basic feelings and needs, he had more brain power available for thinking about what he actually wanted to say. His conversations became more natural because he wasn't constantly interrupted by the translation process for simple concepts. This small change made a huge difference in his confidence. Thomas told me that for the first time since he started learning English, he began to feel like he could be spontaneous. He could make jokes, he could express opinions quickly, he could participate in casual conversations without feeling like he was always 3 steps behind everyone else. The direct connection method gave him a foundation of automatic responses that freed up his mind to focus on more complex communication. But the most important change for Thomas wasn't about language skills. It was about identity. He started to feel like his English-speaking self and his French-speaking self were becoming more integrated. Instead of feeling like he was switching between 2 different people depending on the language, he began to feel like himself in both languages. The personality that people knew and loved in French was finally able to come through in English as well. Thomas shared something really interesting with me about this process. He said that once he stopped translating basic feelings and needs, he realized how much mental energy he had been wasting on translation. It was like he had been carrying a heavy backpack everywhere he went, and suddenly someone had taken it off his shoulders. He felt lighter, more present in conversations, more able to focus on connecting with other people instead of struggling with language mechanics. The success with basic feelings gave Thomas the confidence to expand this approach to other areas. He started applying the direct connection method to describing his work, his hobbies, his daily activities. Each area where he eliminated translation became a foundation for more natural, confident communication. Thomas discovered that thinking in English wasn't some mysterious talent. It was simply a matter of building these direct connections, one feeling, one experience, one moment at a time. Emma from Berlin had a different challenge. She understood English perfectly when reading, but when speaking, she always reverted to German thinking patterns. Emma was a software developer who could read technical documentation in English with no problems at all. She could follow complex instructions, understand detailed explanations, and even write code comments in English. But the moment she had to speak in English meetings or phone calls with international clients, something would shift in her brain, and she would find herself thinking in German first, then struggling to translate her thoughts into spoken English. This was particularly frustrating for Emma because she knew she had all the English knowledge she needed. She wasn't lacking vocabulary or understanding. She was lacking the ability to think and speak simultaneously in English. She described it to me as having two separate English systems in her brain. One for understanding and reading that worked perfectly, and another for thinking and speaking that was completely disconnected from the first. Emma's problem was that her brain had learned to process English passively, but had never learned to produce English actively without going through German first. When she read English, her brain could understand directly because reading is a receptive skill. The English information was coming into her brain, and she didn't need to create anything. But when she needed to speak, her brain would automatically switch to its familiar German production mode, and then she would have to translate everything she wanted to say. She discovered something powerful. She started narrating her daily activities in English inside her head. This idea came to her accidentally one morning when she was listening to an English podcast while getting ready for work. The host was describing his morning routine, and Emma found herself thinking along with him. When the podcast ended, she decided to continue the internal narration on her own. While making coffee, she would think, "I'm pouring hot water, the coffee smells good, I need sugar." At first, it felt incredibly strange and forced. Emma told me that her brain kept wanting to revert to German, especially for automatic actions like making coffee or brushing her teeth. These were activities she had done thousands of times while thinking in German, so it felt unnatural to change the mental soundtrack. But Emma persisted with this internal English narration. When she was walking to work, she would think, "The weather is nice today, I should wear sunglasses, that building looks interesting." When she was coding, she would think, "I need to fix this bug, let me try a different approach, this solution looks promising." She was essentially creating a running commentary of her life in English, giving her brain constant practice in English production mode. After a few days, something remarkable started to happen. It became natural. Emma's brain began to adapt to this new pattern. The internal English narration started flowing more easily, and she noticed that she wasn't having to force it as much. Her brain was beginning to accept English as a valid language for internal dialogue, not just for understanding external information. Emma realized she was training her brain to operate in English mode. Instead of having separate systems for understanding English and producing German thoughts, she was creating an integrated English thinking system. Her internal narration was building bridges between her excellent English comprehension and her need to produce English spontaneously. The process wasn't always smooth. Some days Emma would forget to maintain the English narration and would realize hours later that she had been thinking in German all morning. Other days, she would run into vocabulary that she knew passively, but had never used actively, and her internal narration would stumble. But she kept practicing, treating her mind like a muscle that needed consistent exercise to grow stronger. What made Emma's approach so effective was that she was practicing English production in a pressure-free environment. When you're narrating your daily activities to yourself, there's no one judging your word choices, no time pressure to respond quickly, no fear of making mistakes. This allowed her brain to experiment with English production without the anxiety that usually comes with speaking practice. The breakthrough came when she was in a meeting and automatically responded in English without any mental translation. The meeting was about a technical problem that Emma's team was trying to solve, and someone asked a question about the database structure. Emma found herself responding immediately with, "The issue is in the connection layer. We need to check the timeout settings." It wasn't until after she finished speaking that she realized what had happened. She had thought and spoken entirely in English, with no German step in the process. Emma described this moment as feeling like two puzzle pieces clicking together. Her well-developed English comprehension system and her newly trained English production system had finally connected. She had successfully rewired her thinking process to operate directly in English when needed. After this breakthrough, Emma's confidence in English meetings transformed completely. She was no longer the person who understood everything but contributed very little. She became an active participant who could think on her feet and respond naturally. Her colleagues began to see her as more engaged and collaborative, simply because she was finally able to express her thoughts without the delay and effort of translation. But the benefits extended beyond just work meetings. Emma found that her overall relationship with English changed. She began to feel comfortable thinking in English about complex topics, not just simple daily activities. She could reflect on problems, make plans, and even have emotional thoughts in English. The internal narration practice had created a foundation that supported all kinds of English thinking. Emma's story shows us something important about how our brains learn to produce language. We can't expect our speaking ability to develop automatically just from understanding and reading. We need to actively train our brains to think and produce in the target language. Emma's internal narration method created a safe, private space for her brain to practice English production without the pressures and anxieties of real conversations. The key insight from Emma's experience is that thinking in English is a skill that can be developed systematically. Just like you might train for a sport by starting with basic exercises and gradually building up to more complex movements, you can train your brain to think in English by starting with simple internal narration and gradually expanding to more complex thoughts and situations. Now let me share some practical techniques you can start using today. First, practice internal narration. Right now, as you're listening to me, try to think, I am listening to Julia, instead of translating it to your language. I know this might feel awkward at first, especially if you've been translating for years, but this is exactly the kind of mental exercise that will rewire your brain. The key is to start small and be patient with yourself as you build this new habit. Start with simple present actions. When you wake up, think, I am waking up, I feel tired, I need coffee. When you're brushing your teeth, think, I am brushing my teeth, the toothpaste is minty, my mouth feels fresh. When you're getting dressed, think, I am putting on my shirt, I like this color, it's comfortable. These are perfect opportunities to practice because they're routine activities that happen every day, so you'll have consistent chances to reinforce this new thinking pattern. The goal isn't perfection, it's building that direct connection. Don't worry if you forget to do the internal narration sometimes, or if you catch yourself reverting to your native language. That's completely normal and expected. What matters is that you keep coming back to the practice. Every time you remember to think in English about what you're doing, you're strengthening those neural pathways we talked about earlier. I want you to think of this internal narration as having a conversation with yourself in English. You're not performing for anyone, you're not being graded, you're just practicing the flow of English thoughts. Some days it will feel more natural than others, and that's perfectly fine. The important thing is consistency, not perfection. Second, use visualization. When you hear the word beach, don't translate it. Instead, picture sand, waves, and sunshine. Feel the warmth on your skin, hear the sound of the ocean, smell the salt in the air. This technique is incredibly powerful because it engages multiple senses and creates rich, memorable connections that go far beyond simple word-to-word translation. Connect English words directly to images and feelings, not to words in your native language. This is crucial because it builds what I call English reality in your mind. Instead of English being a collection of translated concepts from your native language, it becomes its own rich sensory world of experiences and associations. Let me give you more examples of how this visualization technique works. When you hear rain, don't think of the equivalent word in your language. Instead, picture drops of water falling from gray clouds, hear the sound of rain hitting the roof, feel that cool, fresh air that comes with a rainstorm. When you hear excited, visualize that fluttery feeling in your stomach before something wonderful happens, that energy that makes you want to jump up and down, that brightness in your chest when you're looking forward to something amazing. This visualization approach works because your brain naturally thinks in images and sensations, not in words. Words are just labels we put on our experiences. When you connect English words directly to the experiences they represent, you're working with your brain's natural processing system instead of against it. Practice this visualization technique throughout your day. When you see objects around you, try to think their English names while really looking at them, really noticing their qualities. When you see a red car, don't just think car. Think about the shininess of the paint, the shape of the vehicle, the way the sunlight reflects off the metal. You're creating rich, detailed English connections that will make these words much more accessible when you need them in conversation. Here's another practical technique that builds on both internal narration and visualization. I call it English commentating. Imagine you're a sports commentator describing your own life in English. When you're cooking dinner, you might think, Now I'm chopping the onions. They smell strong. I'm adding them to the hot pan. They're starting to sizzle. When you're walking somewhere, you might think, I'm walking down the street. The sun is bright today. There are people waiting at the bus stop. A dog is barking in the distance. This commentating technique is particularly effective because it combines action with observation, which is exactly what happens in natural conversation. You're not just labeling things, you're describing processes, noticing details, and expressing observations, all in English. The beauty of these techniques is that you can practice them anywhere, anytime, without any special materials or apps. You don't need a classroom or a conversation partner. You're using your daily life as your English practice laboratory. Every mundane activity becomes an opportunity to strengthen your English thinking patterns. Start with just 5 minutes a day of conscious internal narration and visualization. Set a timer if you need to, and during those 5 minutes, commit to thinking only in English about whatever you're doing. As this becomes more comfortable, you can gradually extend the time or add more periods throughout your day. Remember, this isn't about getting everything right immediately. It's about training your brain to become comfortable operating in English mode. Some thoughts will come easily. Others will feel forced or awkward. Some days you'll remember to practice consistently. Other days you'll forget completely. All of this is part of the natural learning process. The most important thing is to be gentle with yourself as you develop these new mental habits. Your brain has been thinking in your native language for years or decades. It's going to take some time and patience to create new patterns. But every moment you spend thinking in English, even imperfectly, is a moment you're moving closer to that natural, effortless communication you want to achieve. Here's another powerful technique: emotional connections. When you feel happy, immediately think, I feel happy in English. When you're frustrated, think, this is frustrating. You're teaching your brain to express emotions directly in English. This technique is incredibly effective because emotions are immediate and authentic. They bypass the analytical part of your brain that wants to translate everything and go straight to genuine expression. The reason emotional connections work so well is that feelings are universal and instant. When something makes you laugh, that laughter happens before you even think about language. When you feel surprised, that surprise hits you immediately, before any words form in your mind. By connecting English words to these instant emotional responses, you're creating pathways that are faster than translation could ever be. Let me give you some specific examples of how to practice this. When you taste something delicious, instead of thinking the word for delicious in your native language first, immediately think, this tastes amazing, or this is so good, in English. When you're stuck in traffic and feeling impatient, think, this is so annoying, or I'm really frustrated right now. When you see a beautiful sunset, think, wow, that's gorgeous, or this is breathtaking. The key is to catch these emotional moments as they happen and immediately label them in English. Don't wait, don't analyze, don't perfect the sentence, just respond emotionally in English. This creates what I call emotional muscle memory in English. Your brain learns to associate English with genuine feelings rather than just with careful, calculated translations. I remember talking to Michelle from Rome, who started using this emotional connection technique. She told me that the first time she stubbed her toe and automatically thought, ouch, that hurts, in English instead of Italian, she knew something had shifted in her brain. It was such a spontaneous, unfiltered reaction that she realized her English was becoming truly internalized, rather than just being an external skill she had to consciously activate. This emotional labeling works for positive and negative feelings alike. When you're proud of something you accomplished, think, I'm really proud of this in English. When you're worried about something, think, I'm anxious about this situation. When you're excited about weekend plans, think, I can't wait for Saturday. You're building a complete emotional vocabulary that comes from genuine experience rather than textbook learning. Also, try the shadowing technique. Listen to simple English content and repeat it immediately, focusing on the rhythm and flow rather than understanding every word. This trains your mouth and brain to work together in English mode. Shadowing is different from regular listening practice because you're not trying to understand everything perfectly. You're trying to match the natural rhythm and melody of English speech. Choose content that's slightly below your level for shadowing practice. Podcasts, audiobooks, or even English news broadcasts work well. The key is to speak along with the audio, trying to match not just the words but the pace, the intonation, the natural pauses, and emphasis. Don't worry if you miss words or if your pronunciation isn't perfect. You're training your brain to process and produce English simultaneously. When you shadow English content, something interesting happens in your brain. You stop analyzing each individual word and start responding to the overall flow and pattern of the language. This is exactly how native speakers process English. They're not thinking about each word separately, they're riding the wave of the language's natural rhythm. I suggest starting with just 5 minutes of shadowing practice daily. Find a quiet space where you won't feel self-conscious about speaking out loud. Play your chosen audio content and speak along with it, trying to stay as close to the speaker's pace as possible. Some days it will feel smooth and natural. Other days it will feel challenging and awkward. Both experiences are valuable in helping your brain develop English fluency. The shadowing technique is particularly helpful for people who understand English well but struggle with speaking fluently. It bridges the gap between comprehension and production by giving your mouth and brain practice working together in real time. You're not just understanding English, you're physically practicing the movements and rhythms of English speech. Here's another practical application of emotional connections that I want to share with you. Start paying attention to your physical reactions and labeling them in English. When you're cold, think, "I'm freezing," or "It's so cold in here." When you're tired, think, "I'm exhausted," or "I need to rest." When you're hungry, think, "I'm starving," or "I need food." These physical sensations are immediate and honest, making them perfect anchors for English thinking. Remember, consistency beats perfection every time. It's better to practice these techniques imperfectly every day than to practice them perfectly once a week. Your brain learns through repetition and consistency, not through occasional perfect performance. Every time you catch an emotion and label it in English, every time you shadow along with English audio for even just a minute, every time you connect a physical sensation directly to English words, you're strengthening your English thinking pathways. Don't get discouraged if this feels unnatural at first. Of course it feels unnatural. You're changing habits that have been established for years or decades. But just like learning to drive a car or ride a bicycle, what feels impossible and awkward at first becomes automatic and effortless with practice. The beauty of these techniques is that they work with your brain's natural learning processes rather than against them. You're not forcing artificial rules or memorizing lists of vocabulary. You're connecting English to real experiences, genuine emotions, and natural speech patterns. This creates the kind of deep, authentic learning that leads to true fluency rather than just academic knowledge of English. I know what you're thinking. But Julia, this sounds hard, and I make mistakes. Listen, making mistakes is part of the process. When Anna from Rome started thinking in English, she mixed up words constantly. She would think, "I am very happy," when she meant excited. But you know what? She was still thinking in English, and that's what mattered. Anna was so worried about using the wrong words that she almost gave up on the whole approach. She told me she felt like she was making more mistakes when thinking directly in English than when she was translating from Italian. But here's the thing. Anna was actually making progress, even though it didn't feel that way. When she thought, "I am very happy," instead of "I am excited," she was still operating in English mode. Her brain was accessing English words directly, connecting them to feelings and experiences without going through Italian first. The fact that she chose a slightly different word than she might have chosen after careful translation didn't matter nearly as much as the fact that she was thinking and responding directly in English. Don't aim for perfection, aim for progress. This is probably the most important mindset shift you can make in your English learning journey. Perfectionism is actually one of the biggest obstacles to developing natural English thinking. When you're focused on getting every word exactly right, you slow down your brain's natural processing speed and you create anxiety that interferes with fluent communication. Think about how children learn their first language. Do they speak perfectly from the beginning? Of course not. They say things like, "I go to the store," or "That's mine's." But nobody corrects every mistake and nobody expects perfection. Children learn through experimentation, through trying things out, through making approximations that get closer and closer to natural speech over time. Your English learning brain needs the same kind of freedom to experiment and make mistakes. When you're practicing internal narration and you think, I am making coffee instead of, I am brewing coffee, that's perfectly fine. You've successfully thought in English about what you're doing. The specific word choice is much less important than the fact that you're operating in English thinking mode. Every time you catch yourself translating, gently redirect your brain back to English thinking. The key word here is gently. Don't criticize yourself, don't feel frustrated, don't think you're failing. Just notice what happened and guide your thoughts back to English. It's like training a puppy. You wouldn't yell at a puppy for wandering off the path. You would just gently guide it back in the right direction. I had a conversation with Carlos from Barcelona who shared a breakthrough moment with me. He had been practicing English thinking for about a month, and he was getting frustrated because he kept catching himself reverting to Spanish, especially when he was stressed or tired. One day, instead of getting angry with himself when this happened, he decided to be curious about it. He started noticing the patterns. When did he translate? When did he think directly in English? What situations triggered each response? This awareness without judgment changed everything for Carlos. Instead of fighting against his brain's tendency to translate, he began to understand it and work with it. He realized that he translated more when he was rushed or anxious, but he thought directly in English when he was relaxed and focused. This knowledge helped him create better conditions for English thinking practice. It's like training a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it becomes. But just like physical exercise, some days your English thinking muscle will feel strong and responsive, and other days it will feel weak and uncooperative. This is completely normal and doesn't mean you're not making progress. Consistency over time is what creates lasting change, not perfect performance every single day. Let me address some of the most common obstacles people face when they start practicing English thinking. First, many people worry that they'll lose their native language skills if they think too much in English. This fear is completely unfounded. Your native language is deeply established in your brain. A few hours of English thinking practice each day won't weaken it at all. In fact, many bilingual people report that practicing direct thinking in their second language actually improves their overall cognitive flexibility. Second, some people feel guilty about making mistakes when thinking in English, as if they're being lazy or careless. But making mistakes during practice is not carelessness. It's courage. It takes bravery to let go of the safety net of translation and trust your brain to operate directly in English. Every mistake you make while practicing English thinking is actually evidence that you're pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, which is exactly where learning happens. Third, many people get discouraged when their progress feels slow or inconsistent. Some days you might think in English for hours without effort, and other days every thought might require conscious redirection from translation. This inconsistency is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that your brain is building new pathways. Just like when you're learning to play a musical instrument, some practice sessions feel smooth and natural, while others feel clunky and difficult. Another common obstacle is the fear of sounding stupid or childish when thinking in English. People worry that their English thoughts are too simple compared to the sophisticated thoughts they can have in their native language. But remember, you're not trying to impress anyone with your internal thoughts. You're training your brain to operate comfortably in English mode. Simple English thoughts are infinitely more valuable than complex thoughts that require translation. I want to share something that Lucia from Madrid told me about overcoming her perfectionism. She said that she started treating her English thinking practice like meditation. When her mind wandered to translation, she would notice it without judgment and gently bring her attention back to English thinking. This approach removed the stress and self-criticism that had been making the practice feel like a struggle. The truth is, every person who has ever become fluent in a second language has gone through this exact same process of making mistakes, feeling frustrated, doubting their progress, and then breaking through to the next level. You're not behind, you're not too old, you're not lacking some special talent. You're exactly where you need to be in your learning journey. Creating habits is crucial for success. Start small and be consistent. Choose one daily activity, maybe brushing your teeth, and always think about it in English. I am brushing my teeth, the toothpaste tastes minty, my teeth feel clean. After this becomes automatic, add another activity. The key is building these habits slowly and steadily. Don't overwhelm yourself by trying to think everything in English from day one. Your brain needs time to adapt and create these new neural pathways. I want you to think of habit creation like building a house. You don't start by putting on the roof. You start with a solid foundation. Then you add one brick at a time. Each small habit you create becomes a building block for larger, more complex English thinking patterns. When you rush the process and try to think about everything in English immediately, it's like trying to build a house without a foundation. Everything becomes unstable and eventually collapses. Let me share a story about Roberto from Lisbon who mastered this gradual approach. Roberto was an engineer who was very goal-oriented and wanted to see fast results. His first instinct was to commit to thinking in English all day, every day. He lasted about 3 days before he gave up completely, feeling overwhelmed and defeated. When we talked about it, I suggested he start with just one 5-minute activity each morning. Roberto chose his morning coffee routine. Every day, while making and drinking his coffee, he would think in English. I am grinding the coffee beans, the smell is wonderful, I am adding hot water, I need to wait for it to brew, now I am taking my first sip, it tastes perfect. At first, even this 5-minute commitment felt challenging, because he had to consciously remember to switch his internal dialogue to English. But after 2 weeks, something interesting happened. Roberto told me that he began thinking in English about coffee automatically, without having to remind himself. His brain had created a strong association between the coffee routine and English thinking. The habit had become established. That's when we added a second activity, his evening walk. Within a month, Roberto had 5 different daily activities that he consistently thought about in English, and each one felt natural and automatic. The magic of this gradual approach is that it works with your brain's natural learning processes, instead of against them. When you try to change everything at once, you create stress and resistance. But when you change one small thing and stick with it until it becomes automatic, you create momentum and confidence that makes the next change easier. Your brain loves routines and patterns. When you attach English thinking to an activity you already do automatically every day, you're leveraging your existing neural pathways to support new learning. Brushing your teeth is perfect for this because it happens at the same time every day. It involves simple, repetitive actions, and it's something you don't have to think about consciously, which means your brain has extra capacity to focus on the English narration. I recommend starting with activities that engage multiple senses because this creates richer, more memorable associations. Cooking is excellent for this. You can think about what you see, smell, taste, hear, and touch all in English. I'm chopping the onions, my eyes are watering, the knife is sharp, I hear the sizzling in the pan, this smells delicious. Shower routines work well too. The water is warm, the soap is slippery, I feel relaxed, the shampoo smells like flowers. Don't overwhelm yourself by trying to think everything in English from day one. I've seen so many people make this mistake, and it always leads to burnout and frustration. Your brain needs time to adapt and create these new neural pathways. Think of it like physical fitness. If you haven't exercised in years, you wouldn't try to run a marathon on your first day back. You'd start with a short walk, then gradually increase the distance and intensity. The same principle applies to English thinking habits. Start with one activity for 1 week. Focus only on that activity until thinking about it in English feels natural and effortless. Then add a second activity for the second week, while maintaining the first one. By the third week, add a third activity. This gradual progression ensures that each habit becomes solid before you move on to the next one. I want to address a common concern that people have about this approach. Some people worry that starting small means they'll make slow progress. But the opposite is actually true. When you build habits gradually and consistently, you create lasting change that accelerates over time. Roberto, who I mentioned earlier, went from thinking about just coffee in English to thinking about most of his day in English within 6 months, and it all felt natural because each habit was built on the foundation of the previous ones. Here's a practical schedule you can follow. Week 1. Choose one morning activity and think about it in English every day. Week 2. Add one evening activity while maintaining the morning one. Week 3. Add one activity during your lunch break or afternoon. Week 4. Add one activity during your commute or while doing household chores. By the end of the month, you'll have 4 different times during your day when English thinking happens automatically. The key to success with this approach is consistency, not intensity. It's much better to think about your morning coffee in English every single day for 2 weeks than to think about 10 different activities in English for 2 days and then give up. Your brain learns through repetition and routine, not through occasional intense effort. I also want to emphasize the importance of celebrating small victories. When you successfully complete a week of thinking about your morning routine in English, acknowledge that achievement. You've just rewired your brain to operate differently. That's actually an incredible accomplishment. These celebrations reinforce the positive associations your brain is making with English thinking and motivate you to continue building new habits. Another crucial aspect of habit formation is environmental cues. You can make your English thinking habits more automatic by connecting them to specific locations, times, or objects. For example, every time you see your toothbrush, let that be your cue to switch to English thinking mode. Every time you put on your coat to go outside, let that trigger English narration about where you're going and what you'll do. Here's the truth. This transformation doesn't happen overnight, and that's perfectly okay. Carlos from Barcelona shared with me that it took him about 2 months of consistent practice before he noticed he was naturally thinking in English during conversations. Some days were better than others, and some days he felt like he wasn't making progress at all. But he kept going, and now he speaks English fluently without any mental translation. Your journey might be different, but the principle is the same. Consistency and patience will get you there. Carlos told me something really important about his experience during those first 2 months. He said there were weeks when he felt like his brain was fighting against him, when English thinking felt forced and unnatural, when he questioned whether this approach would ever work for him. He had moments where he wanted to go back to his old translation methods because they felt safer and more predictable, even though they were slower and more exhausting. But Carlos understood something crucial. Language learning isn't linear. It doesn't follow a neat, predictable path where you get a little better every single day. Instead, it's more like climbing a mountain with many plateaus, sudden steep climbs, and occasional setbacks. Some days you feel like you're racing up the mountain, other days you feel like you're standing still, and some days you might even feel like you're sliding backward a little. During his second week of practice, Carlos had what he called his dark week. He had been practicing internal narration consistently, connecting emotions to English words, trying to think directly instead of translating. But that particular week, everything felt harder. His brain kept reverting to Spanish. His English thoughts felt clunky and incomplete, and he started doubting whether he was even capable of thinking naturally in English. What Carlos didn't realize at the time was that his brain was actually doing intense work during that difficult week. It was rewiring neural pathways, creating new connections, and establishing patterns that would serve him for the rest of his English learning journey. The struggle he felt wasn't a sign of failure. It was a sign of growth happening at a deep neurological level. This is why patience is so essential. When you're in the middle of that rewiring process, it can feel uncomfortable and uncertain. Your brain is essentially rebuilding its language processing systems, and that kind of fundamental change takes time. If you give up during the difficult periods, you miss out on the breakthrough moments that come after your brain has had time to integrate all the new patterns you've been practicing. Consistency is equally important, but I want to be clear about what consistency means. It doesn't mean being perfect every single day. Carlos wasn't perfect during his 2 months of practice. Some days he forgot to do his internal narration until evening. Some days he was stressed and reverted to Spanish thinking more than usual. Some days he only managed 5 minutes of English thinking instead of his usual 20 minutes. But Carlos was consistent in the sense that he kept coming back to the practice. Even on his worst days, he would at least try to think 1 or 2 thoughts in English. Even when he felt discouraged, he would remind himself that this was a long-term process and that temporary setbacks didn't erase the progress he had already made. I remember talking to Maria from Madrid about this same topic. She told me that she used to measure her progress day by day, which made her feel discouraged because some days seemed worse than others. But when she started measuring her progress month by month, she could clearly see the improvements. After 1 month of practice, she was thinking in English about basic daily activities. After 2 months, she was having emotional reactions in English. After 3 months, she was problem-solving and making plans in English. The key insight here is that your brain needs time to consolidate new learning. Just like when you exercise, you don't see muscle growth immediately after each workout. You see it gradually over weeks and months as your body adapts to the new demands you're placing on it. English thinking develops the same way. Each day of practice contributes to long-term changes that might not be visible immediately, but are definitely happening. This is where many people get discouraged and give up. They expect to see dramatic improvements every week, and when that doesn't happen, they assume the method isn't working for them. But the truth is that the most important changes are happening beneath the surface, in ways that you might not notice until they suddenly click into place. Carlos described his breakthrough moment to me. He was in a business meeting, discussing a complex project with international colleagues. Someone asked him a detailed question about timeline and budget constraints. Without thinking, without any translation process, Carlos responded with a complete, natural explanation in English. It wasn't until after he finished speaking that he realized what had happened. He had thought through a complex problem and expressed his thoughts entirely in English, automatically and effortlessly. That breakthrough didn't happen because Carlos was particularly talented or because he had some special advantage. It happened because he had been patient and consistent for 2 months, even when the progress felt slow or invisible. All those days of practicing internal narration, all those moments of connecting emotions to English words, all those times he caught himself translating and gently redirected his thoughts back to English, they had all accumulated to create that moment of natural, fluent communication. Your timeline might be different from Carlos's. Some people notice changes in a few weeks, others need several months. The timeline depends on many factors: how much you practice each day, how comfortable you are with making mistakes, how much English exposure you get in your daily life, how similar your native language is to English. But regardless of your specific timeline, the process is the same for everyone. Consistent practice over time leads to transformation. I want you to think of patience and consistency as your 2 most important tools in this journey. Patience helps you stay calm and positive during the difficult periods when progress feels slow. Consistency helps you keep building those neural pathways even when you don't feel motivated or when the practice feels challenging. Together, these 2 qualities create the conditions for lasting change in how your brain processes and produces English. How do you know if this is working? Here are some signs to look for. You might catch yourself thinking a random thought in English, especially emotional reactions like, "That's annoying," or "This is delicious." You might find yourself responding faster in conversations, even if your grammar isn't perfect. You might notice that you understand English content without feeling the need to translate every word. These are all wonderful signs that your brain is making the switch. Celebrate these small victories. They're proof that you're rewiring your thinking process. Let me tell you about the first time I heard from Isabella from Rome after she had been practicing these techniques for about 6 weeks. She was so excited because something had happened that completely surprised her. She was cooking dinner and burned the garlic, and without thinking, she said out loud in English, "Oh no, I ruined it." It wasn't until a few seconds later that she realized she had reacted in English instead of Italian. That spontaneous emotional response was proof that her brain was starting to operate naturally in English mode. These spontaneous English thoughts are incredibly important because they show that English is becoming an integrated part of how your brain processes experiences, not just something you access when you consciously decide to practice. When you have an immediate reaction in English, it means your brain is choosing English as the most direct path to express that thought or feeling. You might find yourself responding faster in conversations, even if your grammar isn't perfect. This is actually one of the most significant signs of progress, even though many people don't recognize it as such. When you respond quickly in English, you're showing that your brain is accessing English directly, rather than going through the slow translation process. The fact that your response might not be grammatically perfect is actually less important than the fact that it's immediate and genuine. I remember talking to Pedro from Madrid who was frustrated because his English responses were getting faster, but he felt like they were getting worse in terms of complexity and correctness. He was comparing his quick, natural responses to the careful, translated sentences he used to produce. But what Pedro didn't realize was that his quick responses were actually much more like natural English communication. Native speakers don't speak in perfectly formed, grammatically complex sentences all the time. They speak quickly, naturally, and sometimes imperfectly, prioritizing communication over perfection. Another sign of progress is that you understand English content without feeling the need to translate every word. This might happen gradually, so you might not notice it at first. You might find yourself watching an English movie and realizing that you haven't been translating the dialogue. You've just been following the story. Or you might be listening to an English podcast and notice that you're understanding the main ideas and emotions without converting every word to your native language. This shift from word-by-word translation to overall comprehension is a major milestone. It shows that your brain is starting to process English as a complete system, rather than as a collection of individual words that need to be translated. When this happens with listening and reading, it's often a sign that the same shift is beginning to happen with your thinking and speaking. Some people experience what I call dream English. They start having dreams where they're speaking or thinking in English. This might sound strange, but it's actually a very positive sign. Dreams reflect what your brain is processing and integrating during sleep. When English starts appearing in your dreams, it means your brain is treating English as a natural, integrated part of your mental life, rather than as an external skill you have to consciously activate. You might also notice that certain English phrases or expressions start feeling more natural than their equivalents in your native language. Francesca from Milan told me that she started preferring to think, "I'm so tired" in English rather than the Italian equivalent. Not because she was trying to practice English, but because the English phrase felt more accurate for how she was feeling in that moment. Another subtle but important sign is that you start noticing English mistakes or awkward phrases more easily. This might seem counterintuitive, but when your brain becomes more attuned to natural English patterns, it also becomes better at recognizing when something doesn't sound quite right. If you find yourself thinking, "That doesn't sound natural," when you hear or read English, it's a sign that your brain has internalized what natural English should sound like. Physical comfort with English is another indicator of progress. You might notice that speaking English feels less effortful, that your mouth and tongue move more easily when producing English sounds, that you don't get as mentally tired after English conversations. This physical ease is a sign that your brain and body are becoming more coordinated in English production. Some people experience what I call English momentum. Once they start thinking or speaking in English, it becomes easier to continue in English, rather than switching back to their native language. Marco from Barcelona described this to me as feeling like English had its own energy or flow that carried him along once he got started. You might also find that you start having opinions or preferences about English words and expressions. Maybe you discover that you prefer saying awesome instead of great, or that certain English phrases just feel right to you. This development of personal preferences in English is a sign that the language is becoming truly yours, rather than just something you're borrowing from textbooks. These are all wonderful signs that your brain is making the switch. The important thing to remember is that progress might not be obvious every day, but these small signs accumulate over time to create major changes in how you relate to English. Some of these signs might appear early in your practice. Others might take months to develop. Everyone's brain adapts at its own pace. Celebrate these small victories. They're proof that you're rewiring your thinking process. Each spontaneous English thought, each quick response, each moment of understanding without translation is evidence that the techniques you're practicing are working at a deep neurological level. These moments might seem small, but they represent fundamental changes in how your brain processes and produces language. Staying motivated can be challenging, especially when progress feels slow. Remember why you started this journey. Maybe you want to connect with people from different cultures, advance in your career, or simply feel more confident when traveling. Keep that goal in mind when the process feels difficult. Also, remember that every person who speaks English fluently went through this same process. You're not behind. You're exactly where you need to be right now. I want you to take a moment and really think about your personal why. What brought you to this point where you decided you wanted to think naturally in English? Was it a specific situation where you felt frustrated by the translation barrier? Was it a dream of living or working in an English-speaking environment? Was it the desire to express your true personality in English instead of feeling limited by translation? I remember talking to Sophia from Vienna who told me her why story. She had met someone special who spoke English, and she found herself falling in love but feeling like she couldn't fully express her feelings because everything she wanted to say had to go through German first. She said it was heartbreaking to have deep emotions, but only be able to express them through the filter of translation. That personal connection to her English learning goal kept her motivated through months of practice, even when progress felt invisible. Your why doesn't have to be romantic or dramatic. Maybe you're tired of feeling left out of conversations when your international colleagues make jokes. Maybe you want to travel without the anxiety of language barriers. Maybe you love English movies and want to understand them without subtitles. Whatever your reason is, it's valid and it's powerful. The key is to reconnect with that reason regularly, especially during difficult moments. When the process feels difficult, and it will feel difficult sometimes, I want you to practice what I call future self-visualization. Close your eyes and imagine yourself 6 months from now, thinking naturally in English, having spontaneous conversations, expressing complex thoughts without translation. How does that feel? What opportunities does that open up for you? What kind of confidence do you have in that future version of yourself? This visualization isn't just motivational. It's actually helping your brain create a clear target for the changes you're working toward. Your brain is incredibly goal-oriented, and when you give it a clear, emotionally compelling vision of where you're heading, it becomes more committed to the daily practice that will get you there. Also, remember that every person who speaks English fluently went through this same process. This includes people who seem to speak English effortlessly now. That confident business executive who switches between English and their native language without thinking. They went through a period of awkward translation and slow responses. That friend who makes jokes easily in English. They experienced the frustration of having thoughts they couldn't express quickly enough. I love sharing this perspective because it reminds us that fluency isn't a talent that some people have and others don't. It's the result of going through the process we're talking about. Every fluent English speaker has experienced the exact same struggles you're experiencing now. The difference is that they continued through the difficult phases instead of giving up. You're not behind. You're exactly where you need to be right now. This is such an important mindset shift because many people create unnecessary suffering by comparing their progress to other people's progress or to some imaginary timeline they have in their heads. But language learning doesn't follow a universal schedule. Your brain is unique, your circumstances are unique, your starting point is unique. Let me tell you about 2 people I worked with who started their English thinking practice at the same time. Carmen from Madrid was seeing obvious progress within 3 weeks. She was having spontaneous English thoughts and responding faster in conversations. Miguel from Barcelona felt like he wasn't making any progress at all during those same 3 weeks. He was getting discouraged and wondering if something was wrong with his brain or his approach. But what Miguel didn't realize was that his brain was doing different work during those 3 weeks. Carmen's brain was making rapid surface-level connections, which showed up as quick improvements in her daily practice. Miguel's brain was doing deeper, more foundational rewiring that wasn't visible yet, but was setting him up for more stable, long-term changes. By month 2, Miguel's progress accelerated dramatically and ended up surpassing Carmen's fluency level. The point isn't that one approach is better than another, but that everyone's learning journey unfolds differently. Comparing your week 2 to someone else's week 2 is like comparing apples to oranges. It's not meaningful and it's not helpful. When motivation feels low, I recommend what I call progress archaeology. Instead of focusing on what you haven't accomplished yet, dig into what you have accomplished. Maybe you can't think complex thoughts in English yet, but can you think simple thoughts more easily than you could 2 weeks ago? Maybe you're not having full conversations in English yet, but are you understanding English content more naturally than before? Sometimes progress is so gradual that we don't notice it happening. It's like watching a plant grow. If you stare at it every day, you might not see changes, but if you compare photos from a month ago to today, the growth is obvious. The same thing happens with language learning. Day-to-day changes might be invisible, but month-to-month changes can be dramatic. I also want to address the motivation killer of perfectionism. Many people lose motivation because they set impossible standards for themselves. They expect to think in English perfectly, speak without any mistakes, and progress at a steady rate every single day. But perfection isn't the goal and it's not realistic. The goal is communication, connection, and gradual improvement. Think about your native language. Do you speak it perfectly all the time? Do you never search for words, never make mistakes, never have moments where you can't express exactly what you mean? Of course not. Native speakers are constantly learning, growing, and refining their language skills throughout their entire lives. The same will be true for your English, and that's completely normal and healthy. Another powerful motivation strategy is to create what I call English wins, small, achievable goals that you can celebrate regularly. Maybe your English win for this week is to think in English during your morning coffee routine every day. Maybe it's to have one spontaneous English thought each day. Maybe it's to watch one English video without subtitles. These small victories keep your motivation high and your momentum building. Once you're comfortable thinking basic thoughts in English, it's time to expand to conversations. Practice having imaginary conversations in English. Pretend you're talking to a friend about your day, your plans, or your feelings. Don't worry about grammar mistakes. Focus on keeping the flow in English. This mental rehearsal prepares your brain for real conversations. When you do have actual conversations, you'll find that responses come more naturally because you've been practicing the thinking patterns. Let me explain why imaginary conversations are so powerful for developing natural English thinking. When you have a real conversation, there's pressure to respond quickly, correctly, and appropriately. Your brain has to manage not just language production, but also social dynamics, emotional responses, and timing. That's a lot of mental load, which often causes people to revert to their comfortable translation patterns. But when you practice conversations in your mind, you remove all that external pressure. There's no one waiting for your response, no judgment about mistakes, no social anxiety interfering with your language processing. This creates the perfect environment for your brain to experiment with English conversation patterns without the stress that usually accompanies real interactions. I want to share a story about Alessandro from Rome who discovered the power of imaginary conversations by accident. He was walking to work one morning, thinking about a presentation he had to give later that day. Without realizing it, he started having an internal conversation in English about his concerns and preparations. He was thinking things like, "I hope the presentation goes well. I'm a little nervous about the questions they might ask, but I think my slides are clear and interesting." When Alessandro got to work and actually gave his presentation in English, he was amazed at how smoothly the words flowed. The topics he had thought about during his walk felt familiar and comfortable when he had to discuss them out loud. He realized that his mental rehearsal had prepared his brain for the actual conversation in a way that traditional study never could. The key to effective imaginary conversations is to make them as realistic and varied as possible. Don't just practice perfect scenarios where everything goes smoothly. Practice conversations where you disagree with someone, where you have to explain something complex, where you're excited or frustrated or confused. The more emotional range and complexity you include in your mental conversations, the better prepared you'll be for real interactions. Here's a practical way to structure your imaginary conversation practice. Choose a topic that's relevant to your life, maybe something that happened to you recently, a decision you're trying to make, or an opinion you have about current events. Then imagine you're explaining this topic to different types of people. How would you explain it to a close friend? How would you discuss it with a colleague? How would you describe it to someone you just met? This variation is important because real conversations require you to adjust your language depending on your relationship with the person, the formality of the situation, and the complexity of the topic. By practicing these adjustments in your mind, you're preparing your brain to make these shifts naturally in real conversations. Don't worry about grammar mistakes. Focus on keeping the flow in English. This is crucial advice that many people struggle to follow. When practicing imaginary conversations, your goal isn't to produce perfect English. It's to train your brain to operate in continuous English mode. If you stop to correct every small mistake or search for the perfect word choice, you interrupt the flow that you're trying to develop. Think of it like learning to dance. When you're learning a dance, you don't stop every time you make a small mistake. You keep moving and try to maintain the rhythm and flow of the music. The same principle applies to conversation practice. Keep the English flowing, even if it's not perfect, because fluency is about smooth communication, not flawless language. I remember working with Lucia from Barcelona, who had a breakthrough when she stopped trying to perfect her imaginary conversations. She had been spending so much time searching for exact words and correcting her mistakes that her mental conversations felt stilted and unnatural. When she decided to prioritize flow over accuracy, her conversations became more dynamic, more expressive, and more enjoyable. Most importantly, they started to feel like real communication rather than language exercises. This mental rehearsal prepares your brain for real conversations in several important ways. First, it gives you practice accessing English vocabulary and expressions under low pressure, which builds confidence and fluency. Second, it helps you develop conversation strategies and patterns that you can use in real interactions. Third, it creates familiarity with English conversation rhythms and flows, making real conversations feel less foreign and intimidating. When you do have actual conversations, you'll find that responses come more naturally because you've been practicing the thinking patterns. This is one of the most rewarding aspects of imaginary conversation practice. People often tell me that after weeks of mental conversation practice, they suddenly found themselves responding more quickly and confidently in real English interactions, almost as if their brain had been secretly preparing for these moments. Marco from Lisbon described this phenomenon to me perfectly. He said that after a month of daily imaginary conversation practice, he was in a business meeting and someone asked him an unexpected question about his project timeline. Without hesitation, he gave a detailed, natural response in English. It wasn't until after the meeting that he realized he had responded exactly the way he would have in one of his imaginary conversations. The patterns and confidence were already established in his mind. The beauty of this approach is that you can practice anywhere, anytime. During your commute, while cooking dinner, before falling asleep, any moment when your mind is free can become an opportunity for English conversation practice. You're essentially turning your daily life into a language learning laboratory where every spare moment contributes to your fluency development. As you become more comfortable with basic imaginary conversations, you can increase the complexity and challenge level. Practice explaining complicated topics, having debates, telling stories, or discussing abstract concepts. The goal is to expand your comfort zone gradually so that when these situations arise in real life, your brain is already familiar with handling them in English. Let's be honest, there will be days when you feel like you're going backward. Maybe you'll have a conversation where you translate everything, or you'll feel like your progress has stalled. This is completely normal and part of the learning process. Sophie from Milan told me she had weeks where she felt like she wasn't improving at all, followed by breakthrough moments where everything clicked. Trust the process and be kind to yourself. Language learning isn't linear. It's full of ups and downs, and that's perfectly okay. I want to share Sophie's story in detail because it's so representative of what most people experience during this journey. Sophie had been practicing English thinking techniques for about 2 months and was feeling really confident. She was having spontaneous English thoughts, responding faster in conversations, and feeling like she was finally making real progress. Then she had what she called the worst English day of her life. She was in an important work meeting with international clients, and despite all her practice, her brain completely shut down. Every response required translation. She felt slow and awkward, and she left the meeting feeling like she had learned nothing and made no progress at all. Sophie was so discouraged that she almost gave up on the entire approach, convinced that it wasn't working for her. What Sophie didn't understand at the time was that stress and pressure can temporarily disrupt the new neural pathways you're building. When you're anxious or under pressure, your brain often reverts to its oldest, most established patterns, which for most English learners means translation. This doesn't mean you've lost your progress or that the techniques aren't working. It just means that your new English thinking patterns aren't yet strong enough to withstand high-stress situations. The interesting thing about Sophie's story is what happened next. 2 days after her difficult meeting, she was having a casual conversation with a British colleague about weekend plans. Without any pressure or stress, she found herself speaking naturally and fluently in English, thinking directly without translation. The contrast between her stressed performance and her relaxed performance helped her understand that her English thinking abilities were actually developing well. They just needed more time to become stress-resistant. This is completely normal and part of the learning process. Your brain is essentially running 2 language systems, your old translation-based system and your new direct English thinking system. During the transition period, which can last several months, these systems compete with each other. Some days the new system feels strong and dominant, other days the old system takes over. This back and forth isn't a sign of failure, it's a sign that significant change is happening in your brain. I often compare this to renovating a house while you're still living in it. Some rooms are completely updated and modern, while others are still under construction. Some days you feel like you're living in a beautiful new home. Other days you're frustrated by the mess and chaos of ongoing work. But the renovation is progressing, even when it doesn't feel that way. Language learning isn't linear. It's full of ups and downs, and that's perfectly okay. This nonlinear pattern is actually how all complex learning happens. When you were learning to drive, did you get smoothly better every single day? Of course not. Some days driving felt easy and natural. Other days it felt scary and overwhelming. Some lessons went perfectly, others were disasters. But overall, you were progressing toward competence and confidence. The same thing happens with English thinking. Some days you'll feel like a natural English thinker, effortlessly switching between languages and expressing complex thoughts. Other days you'll feel like a beginner again, struggling with basic responses and reverting to translation for everything. Both experiences are normal and necessary parts of developing true fluency. One of the most important things you can do during difficult periods is to avoid what I call catastrophic thinking. This is when you have one bad day or one challenging conversation and conclude that you're not improving, that the method doesn't work for you, or that you'll never become fluent. These thoughts are understandable, but they're not accurate. Instead of catastrophic thinking, try what I call data collection thinking. When you have a challenging English day, ask yourself what factors might have contributed to the difficulty. Were you tired, stressed, or distracted? Were you in a high-pressure situation? Were you trying to discuss a topic you hadn't practiced thinking about in English? This information helps you understand the temporary setback without making it mean something permanent about your abilities. Roberto from Barcelona shared with me a perfect example of this shift in thinking. He had a terrible English conversation during a job interview and initially thought it proved he wasn't ready for English-speaking work environments. But when he analyzed the situation more objectively, he realized he had been extremely nervous. The topic was highly technical, and he hadn't slept well the night before. A week later, he had a wonderful English conversation about the same technical topics in a relaxed setting with a colleague. Trust the process and be kind to yourself. This means accepting that progress will sometimes be invisible, that some days will feel harder than others, and that setbacks don't erase the progress you've already made. It means treating yourself with the same patience and encouragement you would offer a good friend who is learning something challenging. Being kind to yourself also means not comparing your difficult days to other people's highlight reels. When you see someone speaking English confidently, remember that they've had their own struggles, setbacks, and difficult days. Social media and casual observations only show us people's successes, not their learning process with all its ups and downs. I want to share a perspective that completely changed how I think about language learning setbacks. Instead of seeing difficult days as evidence that you're not progressing, try seeing them as evidence that you're pushing yourself out of your comfort zone. If you never had challenging days, it would mean you were staying safely within your current abilities, instead of stretching toward new levels of fluency. The students who make the most dramatic improvements are often the ones who experience the most frustration along the way, not because frustration itself helps, but because frustration usually means you're attempting things that are just beyond your current comfort zone. That's exactly where the most significant growth happens. When you're having a particularly difficult day with English thinking, try this simple exercise. Remind yourself of one specific improvement you've noticed since you started practicing, no matter how small. Maybe you had one spontaneous English thought last week, or maybe you understood a movie scene without translating. Hold on to that evidence of progress as proof that the process is working, even when it doesn't feel that way. Thinking in English naturally improves all your other English skills. When you read, you'll understand better because you're not translating. When you listen to English content, you'll catch more details because your brain is already operating in English mode. Your writing will flow more naturally because you're composing thoughts in English rather than translating written text. It's like a domino effect. Improving one skill enhances all the others. Let me explain how this integration works by sharing the experience of Andrea from Rome. Before she started practicing English thinking, Andrea was good at reading English technical documents for her job, but it was slow work. She would read each sentence, translate it mentally into Italian, process the meaning, and then move on to the next sentence. A 10-page document would take her hours because of this constant translation process. After 2 months of practicing direct English thinking, something remarkable happened with Andrea's reading. She was working through a complex technical manual and realized she had been reading for 30 minutes without any translation at all. She was understanding the concepts directly from the English text, processing information and making connections without converting everything to Italian first. Her reading speed had doubled, and more importantly, her comprehension had improved because she wasn't losing meaning in the translation process. This improvement happened because Andrea's brain had developed the ability to process English directly. When she read English text, instead of converting each word to Italian, her brain could connect the English words directly to concepts, images, and understanding. The mental energy that she used to spend on translation was now available for deeper comprehension and analysis of the content. When you listen to English content, you'll catch more details because your brain is already operating in English mode. This is one of the most noticeable improvements that people experience. Marco from Barcelona told me that after practicing English thinking for about 6 weeks, he was watching an English movie and suddenly realized he was catching jokes, understanding cultural references, and following rapid conversations that would have been impossible when he was translating everything. The reason this happens is that translation creates a delay between hearing English and understanding it. By the time you translate one sentence, you've already missed the next sentence. But when your brain operates directly in English mode, you can follow conversations in real time, catch emotional nuances, and understand the flow of natural speech patterns. I want to share what happened with Lucia from Madrid when she started listening to English podcasts after developing her English thinking skills. Before practicing direct thinking, she could only follow podcasts if she paused frequently to process what she had heard. But after 2 months of English thinking practice, she found herself following complex discussions about business, psychology, and culture without any pauses. She wasn't just understanding the words, she was following the logic, appreciating the humor, and even disagreeing with some of the speaker's opinions in real time. Your writing will flow more naturally because you're composing thoughts in English rather than translating written text. This integration often surprises people because they expect thinking practice to only improve speaking and listening. But writing is actually a form of thinking on paper, so when your thoughts naturally occur in English, your writing becomes more natural too. Elena from Vienna experienced this transformation in her work emails. Before developing English thinking skills, writing emails in English was a painful process. She would compose each sentence in German, translate it to English, check if it sounded natural, revise it multiple times, and then move on to the next sentence. A simple email would take her an hour to write. After practicing English thinking, Elena found herself composing emails directly in English. Her thoughts about what she wanted to communicate were already in English, so writing became simply a matter of putting those thoughts on paper. Her emails became more natural, more conversational, and much faster to write. Colleagues commented that her written English had become more engaging and personable. It's like a domino effect. Improving one skill enhances all the others. This happens because all language skills share the same underlying foundation, your brain's ability to process and produce the language. When you strengthen that foundation through thinking practice, everything built on top of it becomes stronger too. The integration works both ways as well. As your reading improves, you encounter more natural English expressions that become part of your thinking vocabulary. As your listening improves, you internalize more natural speech patterns that influence how you think in English. As your writing improves, you practice organizing complex thoughts in English, which strengthens your ability to think through complicated topics. I remember talking to Francesco from Milan who discovered this integration accidentally. He had been practicing English thinking for about 2 months when he started reading English novels for pleasure. He noticed that after reading sessions, his English thinking became richer and more varied. The language patterns and expressions from the books were naturally incorporating themselves into his internal English dialogue. This cross-pollination between skills creates an accelerating effect. The more you use English in any capacity, the stronger your overall English foundation becomes. Reading feeds your thinking vocabulary, thinking strengthens your speaking fluency, speaking practice improves your listening comprehension, and listening exposure enriches your reading understanding. Another fascinating aspect of this integration is how it affects your relationship with English culture and humor. When Carlos from Barcelona developed natural English thinking, he found himself understanding British comedy shows that had been completely incomprehensible to him before. The wordplay, timing, and cultural references that depend on direct English processing suddenly became accessible and enjoyable. This cultural integration happens because language and culture are deeply connected. When you think directly in English, you're not just accessing English words, you're accessing English ways of organizing thoughts, English patterns of humor, English approaches to expressing emotions and ideas. This cultural dimension of language becomes available to you in a way that translation can never provide. The integration also creates what I call English confidence momentum. As you notice improvements in reading, listening, and writing, you become more confident in your overall English abilities. This confidence reduces anxiety and self-consciousness, which further improves all your English skills. It's a positive cycle where each improvement supports and amplifies the others. What makes this integration so powerful is that it happens naturally and automatically. You don't need to practice reading, listening, writing, and thinking separately. When you focus on developing natural English thinking, the other skills improve as a natural consequence. You're working with your brain's integrated language processing system rather than treating each skill as a separate, isolated ability. Don't wait until you're fluent to celebrate. Celebrate when you think your first complete sentence in English. Celebrate when you catch yourself having an emotional reaction in English. Celebrate when you understand a joke without translating it. These moments matter, and acknowledging them keeps you motivated. Remember, fluency is built on thousands of these small victories, not on one big moment of perfection. I want to share something that completely changed my perspective on language learning progress. I was talking to Maria from Barcelona, who had been practicing English thinking for about 3 weeks. She was feeling discouraged because she wasn't fluent yet and felt like she was making slow progress. But when I asked her to tell me about any small changes she had noticed, her whole face lit up. She told me about a moment earlier that week when she stubbed her toe and automatically thought, "Ouch, that really hurts," in English instead of Spanish. She had been so focused on her lack of overall fluency that she almost dismissed this moment as unimportant. But when we talked about it, she realized this was actually an incredible breakthrough. Her brain had chosen English for an immediate emotional response. This is exactly the kind of victory that deserves celebration. When your brain automatically reaches for English in a moment of pain, surprise, or emotion, it means English is becoming integrated into your natural response system. That's not a small step. That's a fundamental shift in how your brain processes language. Most people have been conditioned to think that only big, obvious improvements count as real progress. They're waiting for the day when they can have a perfect conversation or understand every word of an English movie. But fluency doesn't work that way. Fluency is built on thousands of these small victories, not on one big moment of perfection. Think about learning to walk as a child. Nobody waited until they could run a marathon to celebrate. Every small step was a victory. The first time you pulled yourself up, the first wobbly step, the first time you walked across a room without falling. Each of these moments was worth celebrating because they were evidence that you were developing a complex skill. English thinking develops the same way. Your first spontaneous English thought is like that first wobbly step. It might not be perfect, but it's proof that something significant is happening in your brain. When you dismiss these moments as unimportant, you're missing opportunities to recognize and reinforce the progress that's actually occurring. Let me tell you about some of the small victories that my students have shared with me and why each one is worth celebrating. Roberto from Lisbon celebrated when he realized he had been thinking about his grocery shopping list in English without consciously deciding to do so. This might seem trivial, but it showed that English was becoming a natural option for his brain, not just something he had to force himself to use. Andrea from Rome celebrated when she caught herself thinking, "I'm so tired," in English at the end of a long workday. The significance wasn't just that she thought in English, but that she expressed a feeling directly in English without translation. Emotions are some of the most automatic, unconscious responses we have, so when they start appearing in English, it indicates deep integration. Sophie from Milan celebrated when she understood a pun in an English comedy show without having to think about it. Humor is one of the most culturally and linguistically complex forms of communication. When you can appreciate wordplay and timing in English, it means your brain is processing the language with the speed and nuance required for these subtle forms of meaning. These moments matter, and acknowledging them keeps you motivated. When you celebrate small victories, you're training your brain to notice progress, rather than focusing only on what's still difficult. This positive attention actually accelerates learning because your brain gets positive reinforcement for the changes it's making. I remember talking to Carlos from Barcelona about this concept. He had been so focused on his ultimate goal of perfect fluency that he was ignoring dozens of small improvements along the way. When I encouraged him to start noticing and celebrating these smaller victories, his motivation and confidence increased dramatically. More importantly, his progress actually accelerated because he was reinforcing positive changes instead of constantly focusing on deficiencies. Celebration doesn't have to be dramatic or elaborate. It can be as simple as taking a moment to acknowledge what just happened. When you have a spontaneous English thought, pause for a second and think, "That's amazing. My brain just chose English naturally." When you understand something in English without translation, give yourself a mental pat on the back. When you respond faster in an English conversation, recognize that as evidence of progress. The key is to make celebration a habit, not something you do only for major breakthroughs. Every time you practice English thinking and notice any kind of improvement, however small, take a moment to acknowledge it. This creates a positive feedback loop that encourages your brain to continue developing these new patterns. I also want to address the perfectionist mindset that prevents many people from celebrating small victories. Some people think that celebrating imperfect progress is somehow lowering their standards or accepting mediocrity. But the opposite is actually true. When you celebrate progress, you're reinforcing the behaviors and mindsets that lead to continued improvement. Athletes understand this principle well. They celebrate personal records, good performances, and technique improvements, even when they haven't reached their ultimate goals yet. They know that recognizing progress maintains motivation and builds the confidence necessary for continued growth. Language learning works exactly the same way. Let me share some specific types of small victories you should watch for and celebrate. Celebrate when you think a complete thought in English, even if it's simple. Celebrate when you have an immediate emotional reaction in English. Celebrate when you understand English content without feeling the need to translate. Celebrate when you respond to someone faster than usual, even if your response isn't perfect. Celebrate when you catch yourself naturally switching to English thinking during certain activities. Celebrate when English words feel more natural than translated words for expressing particular feelings or ideas. Celebrate when you dream in English or have random English thoughts pop into your head. Celebrate when you find yourself preferring to consume English content because it feels more direct than translated versions. Each of these moments is evidence that your brain is rewiring itself to accommodate natural English thinking. They're proof that the techniques you're practicing are working at a deep, neurological level. When you acknowledge and celebrate these victories, you're not just maintaining motivation, you're actively participating in your own language learning success. As we wrap up today's episode, I want you to remember this. Your brain is incredibly powerful and adaptable. You have everything you need to think in English naturally. Right now, as you're listening to me, your brain is processing English directly, understanding meaning, following stories, connecting with emotions. This proves that you already have the neural capacity for English thinking. The techniques we've discussed today are simply ways to expand and strengthen abilities that already exist within you. Your brain has already demonstrated its remarkable adaptability throughout your life. You learned your first language as a child. You've mastered complex skills. You've adapted to new technologies, new environments, new challenges. The same neuroplasticity that allowed all of those changes is still active and ready to help you develop natural English thinking patterns. Age doesn't eliminate this ability. It just means you need to approach the process with intention and consistency. Start with just one technique from today's episode. I cannot emphasize this enough. The biggest mistake people make is trying to implement everything at once. Choose one approach that resonated with you and commit to it for at least 2 weeks. Maybe it's internal narration during one daily activity, like your morning coffee routine or your evening walk. Maybe it's connecting emotions directly to English words whenever you feel happy, frustrated, tired, or excited. Maybe it's practicing imaginary conversations for 5 minutes each day. Or maybe it's the visualization technique where you connect English words directly to images and sensations rather than translations. Whatever technique feels most natural or interesting to you, start there. Master one approach before adding others because solid foundations create lasting change. The important thing is that you start today, not tomorrow, not next week, not when you feel more prepared or motivated. Your brain is ready right now to begin building new English thinking pathways. Every day you delay is a day that could have been contributing to your transformation, but every day you practice, even imperfectly, is a day that moves you closer to natural English fluency. I want you to understand that starting today doesn't mean you have to be perfect today. It means taking one small step that demonstrates your commitment to change. Maybe that step is thinking about your next meal in English, or having a 1-minute imaginary conversation about your plans for tomorrow, or connecting your current emotional state directly to English words. Remember the stories I've shared with you today? Thomas from Paris, who transformed his confidence by connecting physical sensations directly to English words. Emma from Berlin, who rewired her thinking through internal narration. Carlos from Barcelona, who developed natural fluency through patient, consistent practice. None of these people were exceptional or had special advantages. They were ordinary language learners who applied these techniques with dedication and patience. If this episode helped you understand how to train your brain for English thinking, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. When you hit that like button, you're not just supporting this podcast. You're making a commitment to yourself that you're ready to take action on what you've learned. You're telling yourself that this information is valuable and that you're going to use it to create positive change in your English abilities. Sharing this episode with someone else creates accountability and community around your learning goals. Maybe you have a friend, family member, or colleague who struggles with the same translation challenges we've discussed today. When you share resources that have helped you, you're not just helping them. You're reinforcing your own commitment to growth and improvement. Subscribe to the English Talk community for more episodes like this one. This journey of developing natural English thinking is ongoing, and each episode of our podcast provides tools, techniques, and encouragement to support your continued progress. Consistency in learning requires consistency in exposure to helpful resources and motivational content. Remember, I believe in you, and I'm here to support your English journey every step of the way. This isn't just something I say to be encouraging. It's something I deeply believe based on years of working with English learners from around the world. I have seen people transform their relationship with English, overcome translation barriers, and develop genuine fluency using exactly the techniques we've discussed today. Your success isn't a matter of if, it's a matter of when. The timeline depends on your consistency, patience, and willingness to trust the process, even when progress feels slow or invisible. But the outcome is certain if you commit to the journey. Until next time, keep practicing, keep believing in yourself, and keep thinking in English. You've got this. Every spontaneous English thought, every moment of direct understanding, every time you catch yourself operating in English mode without translation, these are all evidence that you're capable of exactly the transformation you desire. Trust yourself, trust the process, and take that first step today.